The sun was sliding down behind the hills, turning the wide frontier sky into a soft mix of orange and gold. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and dust. A lone cowboy rode slowly along the narrow trail. His horse's hooves made a steady rhythm on the hard ground. It had been a long day and he was tired. He had spent most of the afternoon rounding up cattle on the far side of the valley, and now all he wanted was to get back to his small ranch before night covered the land. The cowboy was a quiet man, used to being alone on the trail. He trusted the land and the land trusted him. He could read tracks like others read letters. He noticed when the wind changed. He could tell if someone had passed through a place just by the way a branch bent or a rock was turned over. That night something made him pull on the reins and stop his horse. The air felt heavy. The birds had gone silent. In the distance, the hills stood dark and still. It was the kind of quiet that made his skin tighten. He slowly scanned the ground. There, near the edge of the trail, were faint footprints. 2 sets of small feet and 1 set of larger boots behind them. The marks were fresh. Someone had passed not long ago. He leaned down from his saddle to take a closer look. The smaller tracks were light and uneven, almost like those of children running. The bigger ones behind them were heavier, steady, and closer than he liked. Whoever was following was closing the distance. The cowboy straightened slowly, his face calm but his eyes sharp. This wasn't just a random set of tracks. Someone was being chased. He turned his horse off the trail and guided it quietly through the brush. The sound of a branch snapping somewhere ahead made him stop again. He slowly dismounted, tied the reins to a tree, and began moving on foot. Years of working alone on the open land had taught him how to step without making noise. The closer he got, the more he could hear. It wasn't loud, just soft breathing and a small whimper, like someone trying hard not to cry. Behind a fallen log, he saw them. 2 young Apache girls crouched low, their clothes torn and covered in dust. One of them looked no older than 10, the other perhaps 12. Their black hair was tangled, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. They clung to each other, wide-eyed and silent. When they noticed the cowboy standing a few steps away, they froze like frightened deer. He slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He didn't speak their language, but his calm movements told them he wasn't the one they were running from. The girls stared at him, breathing fast. They didn't trust him, not yet. He understood that. Out here on the frontier, trust didn't come easily. He pointed toward the trail they had come from and then to the trees on the other side as if to say, "Danger is near. Follow me." The older girl's eyes darted back toward the dark trail. She had heard something too, a distant sound of horses moving fast. It wasn't the quiet steps of hunters. It was the kind of gallop that meant trouble. The cowboy made a quick decision. He walked back to his horse, untied it, and guided it toward them. The younger girl took a step back, gripping her sister's hand tightly. But the older one understood. She looked at the horse, then at the man. She nodded slightly, as if telling herself to trust this stranger. The cowboy reached down, lifted the younger girl gently onto the saddle, then helped the older one climb up behind her. His horse was strong and steady, used to carrying heavy loads. It would hold. They rode away from the trail, heading toward the hidden side of a rocky ridge. The cowboy didn't speak. He didn't need to. The girls clung to the saddle, breathing hard, still trembling from fear. The sound of hooves behind them grew clearer. Whoever had been chasing the girls wasn't far. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble, but he wasn't the kind to turn away when someone needed help. The sun was almost gone now, leaving only a soft orange glow on the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the ground. The cowboy guided the horse into a narrow path between rocks where the riders behind them couldn't easily follow. He stopped at a small hollow surrounded by tall trees and boulders. It was quiet here, hidden from the open plains. He helped the girls down and motioned for them to stay behind the rocks. Then he tied the horse near a patch of brush and climbed a short rise to look back toward the trail. In the distance, he saw them. 4 riders. They weren't Apache and they didn't look like ranchers either. They were rough-looking men, riding fast, scanning the ground. They were trackers and they were close. The cowboy's heartbeat stayed steady. He wasn't afraid. He had lived through worse. But he knew this was no small matter. These weren't the kind of men who gave up easily. He stayed low, watching their movements carefully. They stopped at the point where the girls had hidden, looked around, and spread out in different directions. He returned to the girls quietly. The younger one sat on the ground, knees pulled up to her chest, trying not to cry. The older one had a brave face, but her hands shook. The cowboy crouched down to their level. He pulled out his canteen and offered them water. At first they hesitated. Then the younger girl took it with both hands, drinking quickly. The older one whispered something in her native language, and the little one handed the canteen back politely. The cowboy nodded. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of trust. Above them, the sky deepened into a dark blue. A few stars began to shine. Coyotes howled in the far distance. The cowboy kept his hat low, listening for any sound out of place. He had chosen this ridge for a reason. There was only one way in, and he could guard it. He had his old rifle and a strong horse. He wasn't planning to start a fight, but he was ready to protect these children if he had to. The older girl leaned closer to her sister, whispering something soft, maybe a prayer or a promise. The cowboy watched them quietly. He thought about the people who had raised him on the frontier, how they had taught him to help others even when the world was rough. He had seen too many people walk away when it wasn't their problem. He couldn't do that. Not tonight, not when 2 young lives were at stake. The air grew cooler as night fell. The cowboy gathered some dry wood and lit a small fire, just enough to keep them warm but not bright enough to draw attention. The girls sat close together, their faces soft in the firelight. They still didn't speak to him, but their eyes no longer held the same sharp fear as before. There was a quiet understanding now. He had found them when they were alone, and for this night they were safe. He leaned back against a rock, rifle resting across his lap, and watched the shadows move beyond the ridge. The riders were still out there somewhere. He could feel it, but he also knew they wouldn't easily find this place. He had hidden in these lands many times himself, during storms and wild nights when the wind howled like wolves. This ridge was like an old friend to him. The horse stood near the edge of the clearing, ears pricked, alert to every sound. The cowboy trusted the animal more than anything. It would sense danger before he did. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, but not to sleep, just to steady his breath. He knew the night ahead would be long. The younger girl slowly moved closer to him, dragging the blanket he had given her. She sat down near the fire, just a few feet from him. The older sister followed, still cautious, but no longer afraid to sit closer. The cowboy didn't say a word. He just tipped his hat slightly, acknowledging their presence. The fire cracked softly. The night wrapped around them like a quiet, watchful friend. He thought about how strange life could be. He had started this evening alone on the trail, expecting nothing more than another quiet ride home. But now 2 frightened children sat by his fire. Their lives had crossed paths with his, and nothing would be the same. Sometimes the land had its own way of choosing moments like these. The wind picked up softly, carrying the smell of sage and pine. The stars filled the sky, bright and clear. The cowboy tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the darkness once more. No one would harm these girls tonight. Not while he was here. He didn't know who their family was or what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, on this lonely ridge under the stars, he made a silent promise. He would keep them safe until morning. And with that quiet promise in his heart, the cowboy watched the night settle over the land like a thick, soft blanket. The long trail had brought him here for a reason. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could see. The night passed slowly on the ridge. The stars hung high above the land like a quiet watchman, and the wind carried the soft sound of the plains. The cowboy had not closed his eyes for more than a minute at a time. He sat beside the small fire, his rifle across his lap, listening to the world around him. Every rustle of a branch and every cry of a coyote made him turn his head. He was used to this kind of night, calm on the outside, but with danger waiting somewhere out in the dark. The 2 Apache girls had fallen asleep wrapped in the warm blanket he had given them. Their breathing was light and quiet. They had cried silently before falling asleep, but now their small faces were still. The cowboy looked at them and felt a deep weight settle inside his chest. He didn't know their names, and they didn't know his, but he had made a silent promise in his heart. As long as they were with him, he would protect them. In the distance, faint sounds of hooves reached his ears. It wasn't close, but it was enough to make him tighten his grip on the rifle. The men chasing them were still out there. He could feel it. They were not the kind who would give up after one failed night. They would search the hills at dawn. He didn't know how many there were, but he had seen 4 riders the evening before. 4 men chasing 2 children. That thought alone made him straighten his back and watch the horizon even more carefully. The first light of morning touched the land slowly, painting the plains in a soft gold. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The cowboy quietly stood and stretched his shoulders. His horse was already awake, ears turning toward the distant sounds. The girls stirred, blinking sleep from their tired eyes. The older one reached for her sister, pulling her close. They looked around, confused at first, then remembered where they were. The cowboy gave them a small nod to show they were safe for now. He handed them a piece of bread and some water from his saddlebag. They ate quietly, their movements still cautious but less frightened than the night before. The older girl met his eyes for a brief moment. It was quick, but it carried something new: trust. She knew he had stayed awake to keep them safe. The wind carried a sharper sound now. Hooves again, but louder this time. The men were coming closer. The cowboy looked toward the open land below the ridge and saw them. 4 riders moving in a slow line, searching the ground carefully. One man leaned down in his saddle, following the faint marks they had left behind. Another pointed toward the ridge. The cowboy's heartbeat slowed, not from fear but from focus. He had been in dangerous situations before. Trouble had a way of finding him, whether he wanted it or not. He wasn't a lawman, but he had learned how to survive in the wild lands. And this was his ground. He knew every rock and every hidden path around this ridge. The older girl noticed the riders too. She whispered to her sister in their language, and both grew tense. The cowboy raised his hand, palm open, signaling them to stay low and quiet. He moved to the edge of the ridge and crouched down, peeking between the rocks. The men were moving slowly, carefully. They weren't in a hurry. They were confident they'd find the girls. That meant they didn't yet know they were being watched. He returned to the girls and motioned for them to follow him deeper into the cover of the rocks. He guided them behind a thick patch of brush and low boulders. From there, they couldn't be seen from below. He tied his horse near the back path he had used many times before, a path that twisted through trees and opened to another valley. If things went bad, he could lead them out that way. The riders reached the base of the ridge. One of them got down from his horse and knelt, brushing the ground with his fingers. He found something, probably one of the girls' footprints from the night before. He whistled, and the others came closer. The cowboy knew he had little time. He quietly checked his rifle, not to use it recklessly, but to make sure it was ready if he needed to protect the girls. He didn't want to fight. He wanted to keep the girls safe and get them far from these men. The older girl grabbed his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't need to speak English for him to understand what she was feeling. He gave her a small nod, firm and steady. She held her sister tighter. The riders began to climb the lower part of the ridge. Their boots crunched against loose stones. The sound grew closer and closer. The cowboy moved to a higher rock where he could see them but stay hidden. The first man came into view, a tall man with a hard face and a dark coat. His eyes searched the shadows. Behind him came 2 others, while the 4th stayed with the horses. The cowboy breathed slowly. He wasn't the kind of man who liked violence, but he was ready to defend what mattered. And right now, what mattered were 2 little lives who had no one else to stand for them. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the sound of their boots across the ridge. The cowboy made a quick plan in his head. If they came too close, he'd lead the girls down the back path. His horse was fast and the path was narrow, which would give them a good chance to escape. He didn't have to beat the riders. He just had to outsmart them. The older girl suddenly whispered something to her sister, and the little one nodded, pressing her hands together as if holding back a sob. The cowboy gave her a quiet gesture, pressing his finger to his lips. Silence would keep them safe. The first man climbed higher, scanning the rocks. He took a few steps closer to where the fire had been. He stopped, noticing the ashes. His voice called out to the others, sharp and angry. The cowboy felt the moment tighten like a drawn rope. He had to act soon. He picked up a loose stone and tossed it to the far right side of the ridge. It landed with a clatter. The riders immediately turned their heads in that direction. It worked. They thought someone was hiding on that side. The tall man drew his weapon and signaled the others to move that way. The cowboy didn't wait. He turned back to the girls, pointed down the narrow path behind the rocks, and whispered firmly, "Go." The older girl hesitated for a second, then nodded. She held her sister's hand and they moved quietly down the path. The cowboy followed closely behind, leading the horse with one hand, his rifle still in the other. The path was rough but hidden well by brush and trees. He had ridden through it many times when he wanted to stay out of sight. The girls moved quickly, their bare feet almost silent on the dirt. The cowboy looked back once and saw the riders spreading out on the ridge. They hadn't noticed the escape yet. The group reached the bottom of the path, where the land opened into a wide stretch of trees. The morning sun was climbing higher now, and the world was no longer wrapped in darkness. He guided the girls toward the tree line, keeping to the shadows. The sound of the riders echoed faintly behind them, still confused. The cowboy helped the girls mount the horse again, first the younger one, then the older one behind her. He climbed up after them, guiding the horse with quiet but firm movements. The horse responded smoothly, galloping into the open land away from the ridge. Dust rose behind them as they rode deeper into the hills. The girls held on tight. The wind pushed their hair back. The cowboy's eyes stayed forward. He knew they had escaped for now, but it wasn't over. The riders wouldn't stop. They would follow the tracks again. He needed to find a safer place before the sun was too high. After what felt like a long ride, they reached a patch of thick forest near a river bend. The trees were tall and strong, their shade cool against the growing heat of the day. The cowboy slowed the horse to a walk. He guided them into a hidden clearing where he had once camped long ago. Few people knew about this place. It was a good spot to rest, hidden from open sight. The girls slid down from the saddle, breathing hard but no longer crying. Their faces were still pale with fear, but there was also a spark of relief. They knew they were farther from danger. The cowboy filled their hands with cool river water and let them drink as much as they needed. He gave them some dried food from his saddlebag, and they ate quietly. He checked the ground behind them. Their tracks were faint. The forest floor would hide most of them. The riders might not find this place easily, but he also knew that he couldn't stay here too long. They needed to keep moving before the sun fell again. The older girl sat down beside her sister, holding her hand tightly. She kept glancing at the cowboy as if trying to understand why this stranger was helping them. She had grown up in a world where her people often didn't trust outsiders, but here he was, risking his safety for them. She didn't have the words to say it, but the look in her eyes said enough. The cowboy crouched by the river, washing his hands and face. He felt the cold water run over his skin, waking him up fully. He looked at the two girls, then at the distant trees. The danger was not gone, but they had bought time. That was enough for now. He walked over to them and knelt on one knee, looking at the older girl. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly. She tilted her head, trying to repeat it. Then she touched her chest and said a single word. It was her name. It was the beginning of something small but important. Understanding. The forest around them was quiet. Birds sang in the branches above. The river moved softly, making a gentle sound against the stones. For a brief moment it felt peaceful. But the cowboy knew peace on the frontier was always short. The men behind them wouldn't stop. He had to be ready for whatever came next. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the warm sunlight slowly moved higher across the open sky as the cowboy and the two Apache girls rested near the river bend. The water was cool and clear, gently flowing over smooth stones, carrying the soft sounds of nature. The girls sat together on the riverbank, their hair shining in the light. They were still quiet, but their faces no longer held the same look of panic they'd had the night before. The older girl was alert, watching everything around them, while the younger one leaned against her, tired and trusting. The cowboy leaned against a tree with his hat pulled slightly down, but he wasn't sleeping. He had spent too many years alone on the frontier to ever truly relax when danger was nearby. His ears were trained to hear more than most men. He listened to the soft hum of insects, the wind moving through the leaves, and the rhythm of the flowing water. But beneath all that, he could also sense something else, the faint echo of distant hooves. It wasn't close yet, but it was moving in their direction. His eyes opened slowly and he lifted his head. He didn't move fast or panic. Instead, he studied the trees and the trail behind them. Dust was starting to rise in the far distance. The men who had chased the girls were still following. They hadn't given up. The cowboy stood and walked toward the girls. They looked up at him immediately. He pointed to his ear, then to the distant trees, showing them that danger was coming. The older girl stiffened, understanding him without words. She grabbed her sister's hand and they both stood. The cowboy quickly tightened the saddle straps on his horse, readying it for another ride if needed. But he also knew they couldn't just keep running forever. They were running out of places to hide. He looked around and studied the ground. The forest here was thick with strong trees and uneven paths. The river bent sharply a few yards ahead, and there was a natural rise of rocks on one side, a good place to watch from above. If the riders came through, he could use the land to his advantage. He had spent a lifetime reading the wild. Now that skill might be what kept them safe. The cowboy guided the girls toward a large boulder near the bend of the river. From there, they could hide behind rocks and thick brush without being seen. He gave them water again, gently pressing his hand on the older girl's shoulder to calm her. He didn't need to say it out loud, but the look in his eyes told her he would protect them. The hooves grew louder. Branches snapped in the distance. Birds flew suddenly from the trees, startled. The riders were drawing near. The cowboy crouched low, checking the ground one last time. He pulled a small coil of rope from his saddlebag, tied his horse behind the thick brush, and climbed halfway up the rock rise. From there, he had a clear view of the trail leading to the river. The first rider appeared between the trees. He was scanning the ground like a wolf on the scent. His face looked determined, and his horse moved at a steady pace. Behind him came the other three, fanning out slowly, searching for tracks. The cowboy's chest tightened. He had hoped they'd give up, but these men were persistent. He glanced down at the girls. They were hidden well, crouched close together, the younger one clutching her sister's arm. Their small faces were pale, but they stayed quiet. The cowboy was proud of them for that. They were scared, but they were brave too. The riders reached the riverbank and stopped. One of them dismounted and walked along the ground, bending low to study the footprints in the soft dirt. His eyes followed the trail toward the water. Another man pointed toward the bend. They were getting closer. The cowboy moved his hand to the old rifle resting beside him. He had no wish to use it, but he needed to be ready. His heartbeat was steady, not wild. This wasn't the first time he'd been outnumbered. He had learned long ago that sometimes smart thinking was stronger than bullets. He watched the first man lead his horse toward the water. They had found the general direction, but they didn't know exactly where the cowboy and the girls were hiding. The river was wide enough to confuse tracks. The cowboy had led them away carefully, making sure their prints were hard to follow. But still, these men were hunters. They would keep looking. A sharp idea formed in his mind. A risky one, but it might work. If he could make them believe they were being followed instead of leading the chase, they might turn back or at least split up. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small metal spur he had carried for years. With quiet movements, he tossed it far to the left of their hiding spot. It hit the rocks with a sharp clink. The riders jerked their heads toward the sound. One of them barked something, and two men rode off in that direction, thinking someone else was hiding in the brush. The cowboy let out a slow breath. The group was split now, two near the water and two deeper in the forest. That gave him a chance. He slid quietly down from the rock and went to the girls. He pressed his finger to his lips, signaling silence. Then he pointed to the backside of the river bend, where the trees grew thick and the ground dropped into a small ravine. It was a hidden trail that curved away from the rider's line of sight. The older girl nodded. She understood his plan without needing words. He led them quietly through the trees, moving like a shadow. Every step was careful. Even the horse seemed to understand, walking softly through the grass. The river masked some of the sound, and the riders were too focused on the wrong direction. But just as they were about to reach the ravine, a branch cracked under the younger girl's foot. It was a soft sound, but sharp enough to make one of the remaining riders turn his head. His eyes narrowed. He spurred his horse forward, scanning the trees. The cowboy moved fast, pulling the girls down behind a fallen log. The rider came closer, his horse's hooves crunching the leaves. The cowboy held his breath. The younger girl trembled against him, but she didn't make a sound. He slowly reached for a small stone and flicked it toward the far side of the clearing. The sound made the rider look away for a moment. That was all they needed. The cowboy rose silently, leading the girls into the ravine, the horse following. The path sloped downward and curved sharply, hiding them completely from the rider's view. Once they were deep inside the cover of the trees, he exhaled slowly. The sound of the rider's horse faded behind them. They had escaped again, but just barely. They walked for a while through the ravine, where the air was cooler and damp. Sunlight slipped through the leaves in thin golden lines. The girls stayed close to him, their trust growing with every step. The older one no longer looked at him with the same uncertainty she had when they first met. Now there was something different in her eyes, something steady and quiet. She knew he was their protector. After a while, the ravine opened onto a higher stretch of land with a view of the valley below. The cowboy stopped and looked out across the plains. In the distance, he could still see faint movement, the riders circling the forest still searching. He knew they wouldn't stop easily. He needed to do more than just run. He needed to outsmart them completely. He led the girls to a sheltered area beneath a wide old oak tree. The branches stretched out like protective arms, shading the ground beneath. From here, he could keep watch without being seen. He climbed up onto a low branch, scanning the horizon. Then something surprising happened. The older girl climbed up a nearby stone and pointed toward the far ridge. Her voice was quiet but sure. She seemed to know these lands too. Maybe she recognized a safer place farther away. The cowboy followed her direction with his eyes. If they could make it across that ridge, the riders might lose their trail completely. He nodded to her, acknowledging her sharpness. She gave a small, brave smile, the first real smile since they met. It wasn't big, but it was enough to warm something inside him. They prepared to move again, but this time with more purpose. The cowboy checked the saddle straps and made sure the path ahead was clear. He lifted the younger girl onto the horse, then helped the older one climb up behind. He climbed up last, guiding the horse slowly but steadily toward the ridge. The ride through the forest was quiet but tense. The girls held on tightly, their dark hair blowing in the wind. The cowboy kept looking over his shoulder, but the riders didn't appear behind them. His plan had worked for now. He felt a small flicker of hope. When they finally reached the ridge, the view opened wide. Endless plains stretched out before them, the grass moving like waves in the wind. The sun hung high now, bright and clear. It felt like stepping out of the shadow into the open world again. The cowboy slowed the horse and took a deep breath of the warm air. They had survived another chase, but something inside him told him that this wasn't just about running anymore. These girls weren't just frightened children on the trail. They were someone's daughters, and someone was looking for them. He didn't know who their father was or how far away he might be, but he was sure of one thing: he would get them home. The older girl glanced back toward the forest, then forward toward the horizon. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face was strong now, even if she was still just a child. The younger one rested her head against her sister's back, too tired to say anything. The cowboy looked at them both and felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had not chosen this path, but it had found him, and he intended to see it through. They rode on across the open land, the horses' hooves steady and strong. Behind them, the riders were still searching. The sun moved lower in the sky as the cowboy and the two Apache girls rode toward the ridge. The warm air carried the smell of dry grass, and the wind blew softly across the open land. The chase through the forest had taken much of their strength, but for the first time in 2 days there was a small feeling of safety. The girls sat close together on the horse, the younger one resting against her sister's back, tired from fear and travel. The cowboy guided the horse with steady hands, his eyes always moving across the horizon. He knew this land. He had learned to read the plains like a map, and he trusted the signs it gave him. They reached the top of the ridge just as the light turned golden. From here they could see far in every direction. The valley stretched wide below them, with tall trees scattered like green islands in a sea of grass. Beyond that, in the distance, was a narrow river glinting like silver in the sunlight. The cowboy studied the land carefully. If the riders behind them were still searching, this open stretch would give him time to see them coming. But he also knew the riders would not give up. Men who hunt do not stop when the sun goes down. The girls stayed quiet, their dark eyes watching him. The older girl was growing braver. She no longer clung to the saddle like she had before. Instead, she looked around as if trying to recognize something. She was from this land. She probably knew it better than he did. The cowboy noticed the way she tilted her head toward the west, where the trees thickened near the river. He followed her gaze and saw it too, a hidden path that led down toward the water. It was a good place to rest and watch the land without being seen. He nodded to her. She gave a small nod back, her face serious. She was young, but her eyes held the calm of someone who had seen too much too early. The cowboy turned the horse toward the river and began leading them down the slope. The descent was quiet except for the soft sound of hooves on dry soil. The older girl held her sister carefully, whispering to her in their language. The younger one didn't speak much, but she listened, trusting her sister and the man who had saved them. When they reached the river, the air grew cooler. The sound of flowing water filled the space between the trees. It was peaceful here. The cowboy stopped near a thick patch of cottonwood trees and helped the girls down. He tied the horse where it could drink from the river and rest. The girls crouched by the water's edge, washing their hands and faces. Their hair clung to their cheeks, but there was a quiet comfort in their movements. For a moment, they almost looked like ordinary children playing by a river, not two frightened girls being hunted. The cowboy knelt a few steps away, watching the river's surface. The water moved slowly, carrying leaves downstream. He dipped his hands into it and felt the coolness run over his fingers. The long ride had left his throat dry and his muscles aching. He drank deeply, then splashed some water over his face. He wasn't a man who showed emotions easily, but he felt something settle in his chest, a mix of relief and responsibility. He leaned back against a tree and listened. The wind moved softly through the branches and the birds were singing again. That was a good sign. If danger was near, the birds would have gone silent. But deep down he knew this quiet would not last long. The riders were out there somewhere. He had managed to mislead them for now, but they would not stop. Not until they either caught the girls or realized the chase was too costly. The older girl walked up to him slowly. She didn't speak, but she held something in her hands, a small piece of dry wood she had picked up near the riverbank. She placed it near the fire pit he was starting to build. He looked at her surprised, then gave a small nod of thanks. She understood what he was doing and wanted to help. She wasn't just a frightened child anymore. She was part of this quiet fight to survive. The cowboy built a small fire, careful to keep it low so the smoke wouldn't rise too high. The girls sat close to the flames, warming their hands as the air cooled. The younger one leaned her head on her sister's shoulder. The cowboy watched them and his thoughts wandered for a brief moment. He thought about the children he used to see in nearby settlements. He thought about the quiet evenings when families would gather by their fires. He didn't have a family of his own. The trail had always been his home. But tonight, sitting by this small fire with these two girls, it felt different. He felt needed. Then a sound broke the stillness, a distant echo, faint but sharp. It was the sound of hooves. The cowboy turned his head quickly. His horse lifted its ears, sensing it too. The older girl straightened, her hand tightening around her sister's. The danger had found them again. He rose silently and walked to the edge of the trees, crouching low. On the far side of the ridge, just barely visible, dust was lifting into the air. The riders were coming down from the other side. They had found the trail again. Maybe not exact, but close enough to follow. The cowboy's heart didn't race. Instead, everything inside him became calm, like still water before a storm. He had expected this. He returned to the girls and knelt down to their level. He pointed toward the west, where the forest grew thicker. It was a long stretch, but it could lead them farther away from the riders. He then pointed to his own chest and then to the riverbank, showing them he would stay and face the danger if needed. But the older girl shook her head. She didn't want to leave him behind. She trusted him now, and she didn't want to run without him. The cowboy hesitated for a moment, then made a new plan. He would use the land itself. The river curved ahead, cutting through sharp rocks and dense trees. If they crossed through the water, their tracks would disappear. The riders wouldn't be able to follow as easily. He quickly helped the girls up onto the horse again, but instead of heading for the trail, he guided the horse down into the shallow part of the river. The cold water splashed against their boots as they moved through it slowly, careful not to make loud sounds. The sun was almost gone now. Long shadows stretched across the plains. This was a good thing. Darkness was a friend when you didn't want to be found. They moved along the river for nearly half an hour, hidden by the tall trees. The cowboy kept looking over his shoulder, but no one appeared yet. Then when the river curved, he led them out onto a narrow strip of land on the opposite side. There were no tracks to follow here. The riders would have to guess where they had gone. He stopped beneath a tall tree and listened again. The forest was quiet except for the river's steady sound. They had bought more time. He lifted the girls down from the horse, letting them rest on the soft ground. The older one held the younger one close, their breathing still shaky but calmer than before. As darkness fully settled, the first stars began to appear in the sky. The cowboy built another small fire, even smaller than the last one, just enough to keep the chill away. The girls sat near it, wrapped in a blanket, their faces lit softly by the fire's glow. He sat a short distance away, his back against a tree, his rifle resting across his lap. Somewhere in the night, a coyote howled, long and low. The older girl looked up, not frightened, just listening. The cowboy noticed how calm she was becoming. She was still young, but there was strength in her. The younger girl finally drifted off to sleep, her head in her sister's lap. The cowboy saw the older girl gently brush a strand of hair from her sister's face. That small act said more than words ever could. Hours passed slowly. The moon climbed higher, silvering the tops of the trees. Then, far away, a faint flicker of firelight appeared, a sign that the riders had stopped too. They were camping somewhere near the ridge. They hadn't given up, but they hadn't found them either. The cowboy knew tomorrow would bring a final test. The land could hide them only so long, but he also knew something else. If the girl's family was searching, they might not be far away now. He had seen signs during their journey, campfire remains, footprints, horse tracks. He had a strong feeling someone was looking for these two. The older girl noticed his thoughtful expression. She pointed toward the north and said a single word softly in her language. He didn't understand the exact meaning, but her tone was sure. It sounded like a name. Maybe it was her father. Maybe their people were near. That gave him a stronger sense of hope. He nodded, showing her he understood enough. Tomorrow they would ride north at sunrise. Maybe, just maybe, this long chase would finally lead them to the place where they belonged. The fire burned low. The cowboy stayed awake as the night wrapped around them. He could hear the distant call of owls and the whisper of the wind moving through the tall grass. He wasn't afraid of the riders anymore. He had something stronger on his side now. Time, land, and a promise in his heart. The older girl slowly lay down beside her sister, still keeping one arm protectively around her. Their breathing grew soft, steady. The cowboy looked at them quietly. He had spent most of his life alone on the trail. But in just a few days, these two had reminded him of something he thought he'd lost long ago, the feeling of protecting someone who trusted you completely. He adjusted his hat, leaned back against the tree, and kept watch under the stars. The night was silent but full of meaning. The riders might return with the dawn, but something else was also coming. Help. A father. A family. He didn't know exactly when, but he could feel it. The story wasn't over. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next sunrise. The night was long, but it passed quietly. The stars slowly faded from the sky as a soft, pale light spread across the plains. Dawn was coming, and with it, the cool breeze of morning. The cowboy sat with his back against the tree, his hat pulled low, but he had not closed his eyes for more than a moment. His horse stood nearby, ears alert, ready to move at any sign of trouble. The little fire had burned down to gray ash. It was time to go. The two Apache girls were still asleep, wrapped together under the warm blanket. The older sister had one arm around the younger one, as if guarding her even in dreams. They looked peaceful now, not like the frightened children he had found hiding behind a log just 2 nights before. The cowboy watched them in the early light, feeling something he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't their kin, and yet he felt tied to them. He had carried them through danger. He had made them a silent promise to protect them, and that promise was now a part of him. He slowly stood up and kicked some dirt over the fire pit to cover the last of the coals. The wind whispered softly through the tall grass and cottonwood trees. There were no sounds of hooves nearby, which meant the riders were still far or had turned back. He didn't trust it fully, but it gave them a small window to move north toward the direction the older girl had pointed the night before. He believed she had been right. Her people were out there somewhere. He walked to the horse and checked the saddle straps, tightening them carefully. The older girl woke up as he worked. She blinked sleep from her eyes, then sat up quickly, looking around. When she saw him in the quiet camp, she relaxed. She gently touched her sister's shoulder to wake her. The little one stirred slowly, yawning and rubbing her eyes. For a brief moment, they looked like any two sisters beginning an ordinary morning. But this was not an ordinary morning. This was the day everything would change. The cowboy gave them water from the saddlebag and handed them pieces of dry bread. They ate quietly while he scanned the horizon. The sky was wide and open, painted in shades of pink and gold. It was peaceful, but he knew peace out here could disappear in a heartbeat. When they were ready, he lifted the younger girl onto the saddle, then helped the older one climb up behind. She had learned to balance better on the horse now, sitting strong and steady. He climbed up last, took hold of the reins, and gently nudged the horse forward. The three of them rode north, the cool morning wind brushing their faces. The plains stretched out endlessly, but the cowboy noticed small signs, broken twigs, faint hoofprints, and an abandoned fire ring that was still cold but not old. Someone had been traveling this way not long ago. He was sure of it now. These girls weren't lost forever. Their family was searching. As the sun climbed higher, they reached a narrow valley lined with cottonwood trees. A stream ran through it, winding like a silver ribbon. It was a quiet place, the kind where sound carried far. The cowboy slowed the horse to a walk and listened carefully. The girls sat up straight too. Even the horse seemed to sense something ahead. And then it came, a faint sound carried by the wind. Hooves. Many hooves. But these didn't sound like the hard gallop of hunters. These were steady, rhythmic, organized. The cowboy stopped the horse and dismounted. He motioned for the girls to stay behind the trees while he moved a little ahead, crouching low. He looked through the branches and saw them. A group of riders was approaching slowly from the far end of the valley. There were about 10 of them, their horses moving in a calm, deliberate line. Their clothing was different from the men who had chased the girls. These riders wore feathers and beads, their faces painted with the symbols of their tribe. At the front rode a tall man with broad shoulders and long dark hair tied back with leather. His expression was hard and serious, but his eyes scanned the land like a father searching for something he could not lose. The cowboy turned back toward the girls. The older one had already seen them. Her eyes widened and she clutched her sister's hand tightly. A sound escaped her lips, a word whispered with hope and disbelief. She recognized them. These were her people. The tall man at the front suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. His eyes had landed on the cowboy's figure between the trees. For a few tense seconds, no one moved. The cowboy stepped out slowly, keeping his hands open and low to show he meant no harm. The girls ran past him before he could even speak. The younger one's small feet slapped against the grass as she sprinted forward. The older sister followed close behind, calling out words in her language. The father's expression changed the instant he saw them. His serious, sharp look melted into something raw and powerful, relief. He jumped down from his horse in one smooth motion, dropping to his knees as the girls reached him. He wrapped his arms around them tightly, pressing their faces against his chest. The little one started to cry softly, not from fear but from the overwhelming feeling of being safe again. The older girl buried her face against his shoulder. The other riders stopped behind him, some with tears, some with quiet smiles. The cowboy stood a few steps away, watching the reunion. He had seen many things in his life on the frontier: storms, fires, fights, and long, lonely rides. But moments like this were rare. This was something pure and real. A father holding his daughters again after thinking he might never see them. The tall man slowly stood, still holding the girls. He looked at the cowboy, his eyes steady. There was no fear in them. Instead, there was a deep understanding. He walked forward, the girls still clinging to him, and stopped in front of the cowboy. For a moment, they simply stood there facing each other, two men from different worlds. Then the Apache father lifted his hand, placed it over his chest, and bowed his head slightly. It was a gesture that carried weight. It was his way of saying thank you, of giving honor. The cowboy, who wasn't used to fancy words or grand gestures, simply tipped his hat in return. But his eyes held the same respect. He didn't need to explain how he found the girls or what he had done. The man already knew. It was written in the way the girls held his hand and refused to let go even now. The father spoke softly to his daughters in their language. The older girl turned back to the cowboy. She didn't have the right words in English, but her eyes shone with gratitude. She pressed her hand over her heart just like her father had done. That simple gesture said everything she wanted to say. One of the riders came forward, holding a hand-carved feather tied with leather strands. It was simple but beautiful. The father took it and stepped closer to the cowboy. He extended his hand, offering the feather as a gift. In Apache tradition, it was more than just an object. It was a symbol of trust, respect, and honor. The cowboy accepted it with a quiet nod. He tucked it carefully into the band of his hat, where the morning sun caught its edges. The girls stood close to their father, but they kept glancing at the cowboy, not ready to say goodbye so quickly. In just a short time, they had shared something powerful with him. They had trusted him with their lives, and he had kept that trust. The father mounted his horse again and lifted the younger girl up in front of him. The older one climbed up behind. The other riders followed, forming a line ready to return home. Before they left, the father looked at the cowboy once more. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. A promise. A thank you. A memory that would not be forgotten. The cowboy stood by the river as they rowed away, their figures growing smaller against the bright sky. The feather in his hat moved gently in the breeze. He felt something in his chest, something warm and deep. He had spent most of his life wandering, not expecting much from the world. But now he had a story he would never forget. The horse nudged his shoulder gently as if reminding him it was time to go home too. He patted the animal's neck and climbed into the saddle. The trail ahead was long and empty, but it felt different now. Lighter. As he rode slowly back toward the open plains, he thought about the two girls. They were safe now, wrapped in their father's arms, surrounded by their people. He had kept his promise. Not for reward, not for glory, but simply because it was the right thing to do. The wind grew stronger as the sun rose higher. The land stretched wide and endless before him, golden under the morning light. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly, feeling the feather touch his forehead. It was a reminder of what had happened. Not a grand battle, not a tale for loud bars, but a quiet act of courage and kindness on the open frontier. Behind him, the riders disappeared into the horizon. Ahead of him lay the trail he had always called home. But now that trail carried something new with it. A memory, a bond, and a story that belonged not just to him, but to the land itself. He rode on, the sound of his horse's hooves steady and strong, and though no one would hear it, the land remembered. A cowboy had once stood between danger and two young lives and brought them safely home.